Hello and welcome to The Green Room by Deloitte, an award-winning podcast where we explore the topics that matter most in business. I'm Ethan Worth, and this is episode number 64, where we ask, how do we stay safe online?
It gets even more challenging in a Gen AI context, and how do you really ensure you know who's behind that content?
Every new form of media has sparked a moral panic. When the radio came along, when people started watching TV, when kids were playing computer games.
Even books, I think.
How do you then set a policy that ensures that you're putting the line where it needs to be to protect people, while also giving access to information and content that may be helpful to people?
I don't think it's unreasonable that the norms and expectations we have in the real world should apply in the virtual world as well.
Hello everyone, and welcome back to The Green Room. Hopefully you've caught up with some of our latest episodes that have come out in 2024 so far this year, with our latest one being all about modern day survival skills with none other than Bear Grylls. And Lizzie, you were lucky enough to be on that episode. How was it?
I was very lucky to meet Bear and have a chat, and that was about, yes, we've got survival skills to live in the desert or the jungle, but actually how do we deal with modern day survival skills in the world in which we all operate these days? So great conversation.
Amazing. And talking about modern day survival, today we're talking about the internet.
Yes.
and staying safe online. So today the internet is no longer just an addition to our lives, it's more of a way of life. And for most of us, it forms the foundation of how we communicate, how we learn, how we work. And with that comes lots of risks.
Yes,
and
indeed.
Is this something that you're thinking about regularly, Lizzie?
I do think about it regularly. As a mother of an 11-year-old, I think often about the risks with the internet. At the same time, we all appreciate it. And in fact, I really appreciated it when it came back on this morning, because we lost it periodically at in the office this morning, and no one quite knew what to do with themselves for about 20 minutes. And of course, once it came back on again, we all were able to get back into it. But it does make you realise that we really rely on it very heavily, don't we?
But to talk about this topic, of course,
Yes.
we need two esteemed guests as usual. So
We
who
do.
are we joined with?
So this week we are joined by Amanda Storey. Amanda is currently Managing Director for Trust and Safety at Google EMEA. Welcome, Amanda.
Great to be here.
And we're also joined by Nick Seeber, and Nick leads Deloitte's Global Internet Regulation offering. Hi, Nick.
Hey.
First question, just to kind of start things off, the best place to begin is probably just opening up the conversation about the role of the internet. Amanda, let's come to you first. What are some of the ways that the internet has made our lives better and empowered us?
Oh, well, I am a firm tech optimist, in that I really do see the value of the access to information that we have today that we just didn't have when I was growing up. You had Encyclopedia Britannica, you had books, and that was fantastic. But the ability to access anything at the touch of a button now, the ability for people to express their views and share those and find commonality with others is hugely, hugely powerful, socially and in terms of education. And I love the democratization that's created. Anyone, anywhere in the world can get access to the same information. And that gives them opportunities to learn, to grow, to develop new businesses. So I could go on, but I think the internet has done wonderful things for us. But as we'll come on to talk about in this conversation, I think there are some safety aspects as well that my team thinks a lot about.
Indeed. And Nick, sort of what's your view on how the internet has evolved? Do you think things have moved too quickly for many to keep up with? And are we scaling at a natural and a safe pace? What's the impact this has had for business?
I guess the history of the internet over the last 30 years or so is one of exponential growth. And the change which has happened as more and more different technologies have layered on top of each other. So not just smartphone and apps, but websites, the driving of the advertising-based economy for the internet, e-commerce, all of the different types of entertainment we can access, gamification of mobile games. All these different things have resulted in a very complex set of challenges which companies need to figure out how to respond to. And I guess the interesting thing is it's not just one thing at a time, it's everything. So as a new technology comes along, for example, the generative AI explosion in the last year or so, suddenly that changes all the things we had already. It doesn't just create a new challenge, it creates a whole bunch of additional complexity. So it's a lot to process, it's a lot for companies to figure out, but teams like trust and safety functions, that's what they do. You know, they think about what's coming and how they make the internet safe.
Yes.
Yeah, and I mean, I think, so I'm a millennial, not to brag, although probably for some listeners that's not a brag anymore. And I think I'm that generation that's on the cusp of kind of remembers what it's like to not have the internet accessible. I mean, I think it was founded in 1983, but it probably didn't come into people's homes until much later than that. But then as I was a kid, I grew up with the internet, so I'm kind of on that cusp. And thinking about that pace of change is quite mind-blowing to me. Do you think the speed is making it a lot harder? Does that make your job harder, Amanda, at kind of with regulation and providing safety around that?
Yeah, I think the pace of change has been extraordinary, and it's about to get more extraordinary with Gen AI. So when you hear people who've worked in the technology sector for a very long time talk about Gen AI, they talk about it as a massive acceleration and a step change, like the graphical user interface was a step change between you could only use computers if you could code to anyone could use computers and click on a file on something that looked like their desktop. Gen AI is democratizing some of that additional power to be able to digest information, to be able to create new ideas, to be able to potentially get tasks done. And that's really exciting, but it is a massive acceleration again of technology and what technology can do. And one of the things we spend a lot of time thinking about is the dual use of that. So you have Gen AI for positive opportunities in training and helping with certain jobs, for example. But you also have the downsides of the fact that then can enable bad actors to personalize unsafe content and create it and distribute it very quickly, and do that in ways that are much harder to detect. So we have to be developing Gen AI as a safety tool to counter how Gen AI might be misused by bad actors. And we've done a lot of experimentation there with some really interesting results. But again, we need to keep pace because it's moving very quickly.
In light of that, we clearly need some rules, right, to monitor, to manage, to keep people safe online, as we're talking about today. And Nick, why is it so complicated to regulate the internet? What are the challenges of regulating a worldwide tool?
Well, fundamentally, regulators aren't worldwide. They operate in the countries where they're either democratically or they're empowered by the governments. And so trying to get to a point where you have global consistency on something where people disagree on the fundamentals. People have thousands of years of history of disagreeing about who can say what in what forum and what ideas are taboo versus what ideas are obviously true. And that changes over time. And depending on the society or the ethnic groups or the cultures which you're dealing with, there are all sorts of different disagreements about what's true and what should be said and what shouldn't be. That's just content. Then you get into behavior. What happens when you bring people into an online space where they feel that they have anonymity, they have the freedom to do whatever they decide they want to do. You've got lots of different types of users. That adds a lot of complexity as well, because you don't necessarily know who's who online. The sense of identity is a challenge. And so coming up with good, consistent rules, which everyone agrees on, and which are practical and possible to implement, is just super, super hard. And that's why you see all the complexity which we've got at the moment in the regulatory space. There is a lot of debate and tension between different ideas.
If I can add to that, actually, I think as we come onto the sort of child safety space, it is incredibly hard to regulate because A, it's a highly emotive topic, and B, you've got multiple rights and risks that you need to balance. You've got the right of a child to access to information, you've got their right to safety, you've got privacy considerations. And you need to balance all of those things together in deciding what is appropriate for a child at any given age, and what a child needs at different ages is really, really different. What a parent needs to do to protect that child at different ages is also different. When we think about that space of sort of how do you regulate, and why is that complex? We think about, the law is very clear in certain areas, child sexual abuse material, for example, and apologies for the trigger warning, we'll probably talk about some difficult topics. Privacy, age-appropriate design code in the UK. These are all kind of clear areas of the law. Then you layer on all the codes and the frameworks that we have, the best interests of a child, the United Nations rights of a child. But then you layer on what's socially acceptable at that time. And that evolves. And to Nick's point, you can have disagreement between two reasonable people on what's okay. Think about anorexia content, for example. It may be actually very reassuring to someone who is suffering to come across content that shows that they're not alone. For others, that may be dangerous. And how do you then set a policy that ensures that you're putting the line where it needs to be to protect people while also giving access to information and content that may be helpful to people? So that's what we do. That's part of what Trust and Safety does, to try and set those policy lines in the right place and move them over time as the risks evolve and as societal expectations evolve.
It's such a fine line, isn't it, between sort of risk against benefit. And as you were talking there, Amanda, it actually reminded me, I as many teenagers out there are struggling, I have a niece who has struggled with her mental health, and she has actually said to me in the past that she gets a lot of benefit from being able to go onto different social media platforms to get support. As you say, she doesn't feel alone. There's a lot of tools out there to help people deal with their mental health, for example. So again, it's appreciating, isn't it, that there's also a wealth of good stuff and good information to help our young people. Yeah. But against that, of course, we have to regulate and manage the harmful content as well, which we'll get onto.
And just to kind of give an example of how something like that area of policy has evolved over time, we've all agreed for a long time that glorifying eating disorders is definitely against policy, and so that content gets taken down. Something that was developed more recently was this idea of imitation. Any content that would encourage imitation, purging behaviors or very aggressive restrictions of calories, that's sort of a newer area that actually really does deserve to be taken down. And so that's the sort of thing where the policy line is moving over time. That goes far above and beyond local laws, but is really, really important to maintain safety and make sure kids are empowered.
Yeah. As part of the research of this project, I think one thing that came up quite a lot is the Molly Russell case. And just for listeners, I'm sure you guys are very aware of what that is, but just for listeners, it's a 14-year-old girl who ended her own life, and part of the report into her death concluded that it was about a lot of the content that she'd consumed online to do with self-harm, etc., that drove her to that position. But one of the interesting things for me when I was reading about that was that the content itself was sometimes not in isolation considered that harmful, but it was the way in which her social media platforms and other ways in which she consumed information was tailored to her through the algorithms that sit behind it and the kind of quantity that she was receiving. Is that kind of another aspect that we have to consider, that it's not just about the content, but it's about the way in which it's delivered?
Yeah, absolutely. There are areas of harm online where you need to be super careful if anyone is showing any sort of indication they're interested in that space. So there are some areas where if you search for content related to suicide, for example, since 2010, so a really long time ago, we've had what's called a one box, a kind of information panel that comes up at the top of search and gives you access to a local helpline. Because if you're searching for suicide related content, it's really important that that's the top piece of information you receive. That's what we would call a safety by design feature. So it's something where you're actually trying to prevent any unsafe activity from ever playing out. And you need to apply that when people are looking for a particular area of content. You need to also apply that in how a recommendation engine works in certain areas, so that you're not amplifying someone's interest in something that could lead them down a particular path. But that's all in that sort of prevention space that is really, really important in product design. And every platform is different. Some platforms are optimized for images, some for videos, some for text, and they will have different things that users are searching for on those platforms or engaging with on those platforms as a result of what they're optimized for. So each will see abuse playing out a bit differently, and each needs to therefore think through safety by design and prevention techniques in a really bespoke way, so that they are protecting people while also giving people access to information that's helpful to them, content that's helpful to them.
And on that, I suppose it'd be useful to understand from you, Nick, kind of what other forms of connectivity and education should we be prioritising in order to be sort of more careful on how we use the internet? What else should we be thinking about?
So I guess when you're talking about children, the role of the parent and the guardian is really important. And I think it's important not to make parents feel like they have to be the police. Like that relationship between a parent or a guardian and a child is so important. You want to be on the same team. You want to have a trust that people can, or children can, raise things they're worried about, things which have scared them or disturbed them, and have the ability to discuss it openly. So I think giving children and parents, I'm using the term as a catch-all for anyone who has that responsibility for a child, the tools to be able to manage the information and the content which their children have or child has access to, the choices to be able to parent in the way which works for them, and then the information and the understanding of what the risks might be, because parents may not be aware of what the challenges are which face children online. It moves so quickly, as we talked about before.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Can I share the 3 stories that I tell primary school parents,
Please,
peers
please.
of mine? Apologies, kind of trigger warnings for anyone, but I think these stories help to kind of hockey stick people up the learning curve of actually what are the risks. And I agree, the risks vary at different ages, but this sort of gives a flavour, particularly to those of us who didn't grow up with the internet, so don't have as much familiarity with it. The first is a story fairly recently of a year 5 child who'd learnt online they could make money by videoing people changing at their school in the changing room, and took a video covertly and sold it online, year 5.
Wow.
The second is the concept of sextortion that most parents are not familiar with at all. But it's this idea that your child may be lured into distributing imagery of themselves, potentially naked, or have that imagery deepfaked from an image that exists of them online, and then be extorted in order to persuade them to send money or to send additional imagery and content. And the third is a lot of people very innocently put photos of their kids, doing a ballet class or on the beach. And what they don't know and don't really want to know, but it's important, is that sometimes those images can turn up elsewhere, cropped, zoomed in, with commentary on forums that you really don't want a picture of your child. Sorry to talk about such horrible examples, but I think just having examples like that top of mind for parents changes the way they think about the challenge. And Nick, to your point, it shouldn't be a policing relationship. It actually has to be a supportive relationship. You have to know that your child is going to come to you if they find themselves in a sextortion situation and tell you that that's happened and seek your help with it. Yeah. But if we don't know the risks, then we don't know to set up as a conversation before it happens that that's okay.
Yeah. And you've laid out some of the risks there, which are really stark, and the importance of it is clear. So this could probably be a podcast in itself, but what are some of the things that Google is doing to help mitigate this risk for children?
Yeah, so we have what we call the trust and safety funnel, which is the way we think about abuse manifesting across our platforms and how we can tackle that abuse and manage those risks to keep all of the content safe. So what my team does is we set the policies and then we enforce them at scale. And we make sure that we're constantly measuring safety and enhancing in areas where the safety issues are evolving. So that starts with prevention. It starts with safety by design, which we talked a little bit about before, but also things like active verification, make sure we actually know who's using the service, so make sure the content from them or to them is safe. And our policies. Good actors are going to try and meet the policies if you make them clear and easy to understand. It's only the bad actors who are trying to circumvent and avoid detection. So that's prevent. The second layer of the funnel is detection. So we have what we call classifiers, which are pieces of machine learning that run across all of our platforms, 24/7, 365 days a year, to try to, at scale and at speed, detect things that violate our policies or violate local laws. Those classifiers are then complemented by our human review teams. We have over 20,000 moderators around the world in all languages, specialized in different areas of abuse or different products, who are then looking at things where the machine couldn't make a decision on its own. So they're the edge cases. They're the things where there's nuance, there's context to be taken into account to make a decision. All of those decisions then feed back into making the classifiers better. And that's all supplemented by flags that we get from experts in different countries around the world, from users when they're flagging things within the product interface, and from governments who will send things to us that they have found. So that's detection. And then you've got to have response, right? Because there are going to be things that evade detection for whatever reason. Spoofing of websites, cloaking is a technical technique used where essentially the bad actor is showing different content to us than the end user sees. So there's some really interesting techniques that are being used by bad actors to try to continue to distribute bad content and circumvent our detection techniques. So we're constantly looking out for that. We're looking at incidents that play out. We're looking at crisis response tools. We're looking at appeals that we see from content owners or end users where they've been presented with something that was unsafe, or indeed a creator has had something taken down that they disagree and they think should not have been taken down. And all of that then helps us to get better prevention detection upstream. So that's how we think about the work. It's an approach we've used for many years, and it constantly evolves. It's a really dynamic space.
Did you know at Deloitte we support social enterprises through our 5 Million Futures programme? One of my favourites is Luminary Bakery in London. They use baking as a tool to take women on a journey to employability and entrepreneurship, equipping them with transferable skills for the working world. Their letterbox brownies are incredible, and they even have a cookbook. If you fancy a taste, just head to luminarybakery.com. Now, back to our topic of the day. And Nick, we talked earlier about how hard it is to regulate and legislate for something as large as the internet, but there is now the Online Safety Act. Could you tell us a little bit about the Act and how it's intended to help?
Absolutely. It's been in discussion for a long time in the UK. So there was a big consultation about online harms. The bill has gone through numerous iterations in Parliament, and it's now in law. It's not in force per se. Once the regulator Ofcom provides more guidance, there'll be clarity for the digital platforms which are affected by the law. But in fact, there are potentially as many as 100,000 businesses which operate in the UK which will be affected by the law in some shape or form. Effectively, what the Online Safety Act does is looks at user-generated content and the potential harms which can be caused by user-generated content. We've talked already about a bunch of them, but especially protecting children, age verification for adult content, and then more generally protections around harmful content like misinformation in the context of elections. That's another area of focus. The Online Safety Act, though, isn't the only prominent law around content and protecting children. Digital platform companies have been preparing for compliance with the EU's Digital Services Act for the last couple of years. So the Digital Services Act, like the OSA, is a principles-based regulation. It sets out a number of principles which companies need to look at as they consider the risks. So it's not about setting a bunch of standards which are ticked off. There's a lot of judgment which companies need to make about the way in which their platforms affect users and the harms which there might be, and then the actions and the safeguards which they can put in place or already have in place in terms of demonstrating that compliance. It is a really complicated area. There's lots and lots of things which companies can do, but I guess the reassuring thing is that it's being taken very seriously.
I can imagine some listeners, maybe less now after some of the examples we've heard, but thinking, I can go to a coffee shop, I can have a conversation, and that's not regulated by the government. Why is it when I do it over text or instant messenger, the government gets involved? What are some of your kind of thoughts around that, around the need and for regulation and the right of the government to do so?
Bringing that real world example, and Amanda, you'll have a bunch I'm sure as well, is a good way to contextualize it. So if my child, a 10-year-old, walks into a newsagent and says, I want to buy a top shelf magazine with adult content in it, the shopkeeper will say, well, it looks like you're a child. That's an adult content. That's a magazine which is not permitted to be sold to a child, and wouldn't sell it to them. Whereas online, it's very easy for children to access inappropriate content, pornography, adult material in a way which you wouldn't expect in the real world. Similarly, identity and age verification is something which you encounter in all sorts of other contexts as well. So if you're going to the cinema and you want to watch a movie and it's got an age rating on it, there's an expectation you might have to provide identity to show that you're old enough to do that. I don't think it's unreasonable that the norms and expectations we have in the real world should apply in the virtual world as well. And it's not about saying there's a completely different expectation, but whether it's about what you can say in a library versus in a pub versus in somebody's private house. Like, each of these environments has a different expectation of what the social norms are, and bringing those and translating them into a virtual world, I think, is an important step in, our evolution as society.
I think that's exactly right. I think there are some expectations offline that absolutely directly translate online. I do think there's also a set of issues here that are fundamentally different in quality than the offline experience. So the internet is fundamentally global. So you suddenly have people able to access anything from any part of the world, where the laws may be different, the social expectations and norms may be different. You also have, obviously, sort of fast and frictionless distribution at effectively zero cost, which creates a different kind of category of challenge than in the offline world. So I do think it's important to take those norms and expectations, but then also think sort of above and beyond those about how do you translate that into what is a slightly different problem set.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think that's spot on. Yeah.
You mentioned earlier, Nick, the example of if a child doesn't look at the appropriate age to buy adult content in a newsagent, for example. Online, you talked earlier about verification checks and age checks, but how does it work when a child says, yes, I am 18? I'm just asking for a practical example because I've never really understood how that works.
Yeah, so there are certain areas where we provide tools to parents, for example, Family Link, where you can kind of control what your child is able to access. So there are some sort of prevention techniques to protect, particularly if you have younger children in the household. There's also the behavioural indicators. So if someone is searching for Peppa Pig videos, the likelihood is they're a child. And at that point, certain default protections are put in place, things like safe search, where you will not get access to explicit content, for example, within a safe search environment. And then there's the content itself, and just making sure that there is never content appearing that is unsafe for all types of people, whether child or adult. So it's really that kind of actor behavior content ABC structure that we use as we think about how to protect people. But age verification, people lying about their age online, it's challenging. People will, and so you cannot just rely on that. It has to be the behaviour and the content level as well.
Interesting.
I do think there is a way to go, and I think the next decade will really see a lot more thinking about decentralised identity. So people owning their own identity and having interoperable standards where your identity can hook into browsers, apps, other online environments, and making it secure so that the institutions, whether it's schools, healthcare, work, all sorts of other affiliations, can be represented properly online. So in the same way that you might have a uni card which shows that you're a member of a particular university, or you have a bus pass, or you have your driving license, all of these different things in the physical world, there's an opportunity to create that analog in the digital world where our identity is properly linked to us. Now, people get scared about that because they worry about the abuse of people's identity online. But that is the core problem we face, because if we don't know whether users are children or who they are online, it does create lots of challenges which are very hard to solve otherwise. So I think that's the opportunity for an ecosystem. It's not the job of any one company to own or manage that. It's about all the different tools and systems we use online working together in a way which supports secure, private identity.
Yeah, what you're describing is the provenance problem, right? How do you know where the consumer or the creator comes from? And to do that well, you need people to believe in that as a solution. And there are some privacy advocates who fight vehemently against what you're describing for very good reasons. But you also need then all creators to be adhering to that standard, because want to be able to tell who the creator was and whether they're safe or not. And of course, bad actors will inevitably try to evade or circumvent or break that standard. So provenance is a real challenge, and it gets even more challenging in a Gen AI context where you have a lot more personalized content created at scale, at speed. And how do you really ensure you know who's behind that content? That would be hugely valuable to a trust and safety business to actually have clarity of provenance on the creator side. It's currently an unsolved problem, but one that a lot of very smart people around the world are trying to figure out. How do we create that standard? How do we roll that out and make it completely adopted before the explosion of Gen AI generated content?
And it's fascinating listening to kind of this talk about the future and the regulatory challenges that are coming, and also the tools that you've mentioned. So AI seems to be part of the solution, but also part of the problem. But Nick, in your work, when you're advising businesses, how do you help them navigate through this complexity in this environment?
One of the challenges is that there are lots of different obligations to meet. And on the horizon, there are new laws being proposed all the time, some of which come into force. So having a good perspective on how to identify what's coming in enough time to make changes and without breaking the business is really important. So having that kind of horizon scanning and the work which teams in government affairs and public policy do already, but equipping and empowering them. The second piece, I guess, is about making sure that the broader business is involved in identifying what's to be done when a new law passes and new obligations come into force. So having that governance which involves not just legal teams, but product teams and engineering teams, support teams, risk teams and compliance teams, obviously, but also strategy teams as well. Like, what's the implication for our competitive positioning? And having that governance quite early on to identify how you can bring new requirements into compliance without creating mountains of additional work to be done. And then the third piece, and this is where I think there's a lot of excitement in the sector, is saying, as digital platforms, we've created these billion user environments which run in milliseconds with lots of automated functionality. And why shouldn't our compliance be created in the same sort of way? Like, why shouldn't we operate age verification, for example, using centralized services which hold all of the rules, which comply with all the regulations, and no individual product manager or product engineer has to figure out all the answers for themselves? You've got a centralized microservice, for example, which runs all of that centrally. Now, that's a little way away because there's a lot to build, and people are panicking now because there's lots and lots of work to be done in a very short period of time. But longer term, 3 to 5 years, that's where things will go. You know, why should you add thousands and thousands of people to your organization when there's a better way to do it, which aligns with all the rest of the ways these platforms work?
I think that's exactly right, Nick. I think that, to the extent we can code in minimum safety standards and have that be entirely auditable, that is great. And something we've been doing for many years, and the regulations are now having some oversight of those systems, those tools, those approaches. I think what you hinted at, but that has been particularly challenging from the platform perspective, is just the speed of some of these regulations and the lateness of some of the guidance coming in. When you look at GDPR, we had a final text and then an enforcement window with 2 years to get ready. With the Digital Services Act in the EU, we got the final text and then had 8 months to be ready. And some of the guidance for different regulations around the world comes literally weeks before things are meant to be enforced. And building technology, changing infrastructure just has a longer time horizon. So that is a challenge that we're all wrestling with, as well as the somewhat different approaches and focuses of the different regulations around the world and adhering to all of them, all in these very tight timelines. So, if the UK defines the areas of concern in safety differently to the way the EU does, we need to be able to have the Rosetta Stone to cut our business data into those different taxonomies of risk. And that again is a data infrastructure problem. We have a way we look at risks and different categories of abuse, but it's slightly different than those two, and we have to be able to provide our data in those ways. So those are some of the things that we're wrestling with right now. But I think the principle of a lot of the online safety regulations that we're seeing around the world is absolutely right, which is this is all about risk governance, it's all about risk balancing, and there should be a level of oversight. We've been doing this work for a long time, and we are always balancing those risks. That's what we do every day to make sure the policies are set in the right place and make sure our classifiers are finding the bad content quickly and at high quality, consistently, and tweaking that precision, that recall of the different systems every single day to make sure we're staying safe.
And Nick, can you tell us a little bit more about what you and Deloitte are doing to support this important topic and work with organisations to help them?
Yeah. So the last 3 or 4 years, we've stood up a dedicated offering focused on internet regulation. And we've brought together all the different experts across our businesses, lawyers and auditors, technologists, strategists, people who deal in organizational change, and then obviously all the risk and compliance and regulatory expertise we have in our risk advisory business. We focus on that multidisciplinary model and taking a global approach because the platform businesses we work with are global. We need to take that bigger picture view. We tend to lean into the most gnarly and complex challenges. So that's where we can really make the biggest impact rather than piecemeal bits and pieces here and there. And we focus on practical operational compliance. So helping deliver the change to enable companies not just to be compliant, but actually to add more value and give a better service to their users, to their customers as part of that compliance journey. We don't lobby or advocate on behalf of customers. That's a red line for us. That's not part of our business. We also don't do content moderation ourselves. So this is something which we've taken a decision. It's something which Deloitte doesn't feel that we have the right skills mix to do, and so that's not part of our business model. I think this conversation.
The adding value point was really interesting, and it's something I was wondering throughout this conversation. So, and maybe Amanda, you could shed some light on this, but as well as the kind of legal requirements and the social and moral requirements, is there kind of commercial incentives that underpin being more safe online?
Oh, 100%. So, I mean, our business makes money essentially out of advertising and cloud, some app sales as well, but those are sort of the fundamental tenets of it. And you cannot have a successful advertising ecosystem if it's unsafe. The brands don't want to be associated with it. The users will not come back to it. The publishers don't want bad ads serving on their sites. So it's absolutely a commercial imperative for us to get it right and make sure we can not only ensure a brand safe environment and a user safe environment, but also prove that where we need to regulators and auditors and others around the world.
It's interesting to, I mean, you've spoken a lot about the role of technology and the work that Google is doing, and we've talked about business, and I just wonder, you mentioned the word ecosystem earlier, I think both of you mentioned it, and who are the other players here that we need to be thinking about? What's the role of education, for example, in keeping children safe online?
We touched on some of them. There's obviously all the different types of digital platform company, from the infrastructure and the cloud platforms up through to smartphones and hardware. Obviously, VR devices is a whole new category and realm of potential challenge for trust and safety teams, through to apps and then information services more generally. So that's the kind of the digital, the internet companies, as we call them. But then there's all of the media companies and other businesses which operate online payments platforms, brands, all sorts of other parts of that supply chain. You've got law enforcement, academia studying, how the effects of these things work, public policy groups, politicians, lawmakers and regulators. There's obviously all sorts of other institutions, and you mentioned there education, the education sector. So what's the role of getting children to understand what the internet is from primary school, and upwards? But I come back, like I did at the start, to the role of the parent and that relationship with the child. That position of parental authority is such an important one, and it's such a big accountability for protecting children. I think that there is a lot which we can do to give parents tools, choices and better understanding of what they can do to keep children in their care safe.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I mean, we have a bunch of online education tools we offer to kids as young as primary school, things like Be Internet Awesome, which is fabulous. If your kids haven't played with it, I'd really encourage it. My kids love it. And it does teach them about safety online in a really effective, age-appropriate way. But I agree, the education of parents via schools, via the government, via just learning themselves is really critical here. One of the best techniques I've heard so far is really simple, really analog, but give your child a card and say, if you come to me with this card one day because something really awful has happened online, I promise not to be angry. Right? So the kid just keeps the card in their bedroom. Really simple, but actually really, really helpful for parent and child to know that they have that get out of jail free card. And then coming back to your kind of ecosystem question, one of the things that we're really focused on, happened for many years, is signal sharing across the ecosystem. So we see slices of a user journey. But user journeys can weave on and offline, they can weave on and off our platforms, they can weave into private and encrypted environments. So we're not seeing the entire user journey. And we can only stitch together the signals we have. If we can do more signal sharing across tech, banking, telco, government, law enforcement, NGOs, there are opportunities actually for us to understand more of the user journey and ascertain which of those user journeys are unsafe. And that's really powerful. And the legal frameworks are a bit complicated in this space. Things like privacy laws kind of rightly restrict some of the signals we can share, particularly before abuse has been actually clarified as having happened. But that sort of signal sharing across the ecosystem is super powerful if we can do that well as a country, not just in the child safety space, but in spaces like scams and disinformation.
Okay, so we've covered loads of topics today, but just to wrap things up, what are some of the kind of key takeaways and those key quick wins that we can fix, some of those regulation processes that we're missing today that we can envision solving in the near future?
So I guess one of the things to bear in mind is that every new form of media has sparked a moral panic. When the radio came along, when people started watching TV, when kids were playing computer games.
Even books, I think.
Yeah, books. Comic books was a huge panic in the 1950s, and there was a government intervention to create the comic book code, where you had to make sure that good always conquered evil, and that authority figures were always respected, and that family values were at the heart of all the comic books. And there was this whole regulatory response to comic books. So I think we need to avoid over-engineering our response. But fundamentally, we care about everyone online. We care about protecting children especially because they're more vulnerable. And there is a lot which is going on already. So as we talked about earlier, I think we're both optimists for technology and the impact of the internet. The net benefit of the internet is absolutely enormous. And so we shouldn't lose sight of that. But there is lots which we can do to make sure that everyone is safe online and that everyone has a good experience when they're on the internet.
And I guess to answer the question from my perspective, I go back to the trust and safety funnel that I talked about earlier, prevent, detect, respond, because I think there are slightly different responsibilities at each layer of that funnel. I think in the case of prevention, it is down to the platforms to make sure we're preventing harm really effectively through things like safety by design and through sharing tools and techniques where we have ones that are working really effectively. We have something called the Child Safety API where we offer it to any tech platform. It's used by many and NGOs as well to detect the worst of the worst child sexual abuse material. And it's processing at this point billions of images and videos across the industry every day and helping everyone to get that space right and take that content down. That sort of sharing of prevention tools is really, really powerful and something that we do through our Google Safety Engineering Centre in Dublin and many other mediums. At the detection layer, I think it's a shared responsibility. I think it comes back to the ecosystem point you were making of we see some signals, others see other signals. Law enforcement, government see signals that no one in the tech industry is necessarily seeing. And we need to find better ways to blend those signals together to enhance the detection that we're doing with our classifiers, with our humans, and through our flagging partnerships. And then in the response space, yes, we're responding and making sure we handle crises and so on, but that's where there's an individualized responsibility. It's where education comes in. Parents can educate themselves, kids can educate themselves, parents can have the hard conversation with their children early, before anything terrible has happened, and evolve that over time as the risks manifest differently at different ages. So I think prevention is down to the tech platforms, mostly, to do well. Detection, shared endeavor, response, more individuated. And I think that education piece is really, really critical, and hopefully something that people can take away from today's conversation.
Great. And as is tradition, again, don't want you to repeat yourselves, and it's a bit of a challenge, but in one sentence, the big question of the day, how do we stay safe online?
Having access to better tools, able to make choices about customizing the experience online, and then access to education and better understanding about what the risks are.
Perfect.
I would say understand the risks and enjoy the possibilities.
Yeah,
Nice
way to finish.
Really nice.
It's not all bad.
No, not at all.
Thank you so much, Amanda and Nick. It's been a fantastic conversation. I've learnt a lot, and thanks very much for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having us.
Speak to you. Thanks for listening to this episode of The Green Room by Deloitte. We release a new episode every other Tuesday with another big question, so don't forget to hit follow or subscribe to this podcast wherever you're listening or watching. That way you'll be alerted whenever a new episode drops. This podcast is produced by our very own Pod Squad and hosted by Lizzie Elston, Ethan Worth and Annie Wong. Original music by Ali Barrett.